Welcome to the I-24 News National Security Podcast in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedeck. Each week, we're bringing you in-depth discussions with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. Right now, Israel is fighting its longest war in history. It's been at war for more than 400 days now, and wars cost money. Right now, Israel is up against a ring of fire, a seven-front war orchestrated by Iran and its proxies in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. While this has clearly had the greatest impact on Israeli society, with nearly 800 fallen soldiers and more than 800 civilians killed, it's also taken a costly hit to the economy. Roughly 250 billion shekels, or the equivalent of $66 billion. Just this month, in the beginning of November, the Israeli government approved the 2025 state budget, and it's set to be the largest budget in Israel's history. More than 600 billion shekels, or $160 billion. And 20 billion of those dollars will be towards defense alone. Now let's remember, Israel is a small country of only 10 million people. And although the tiny nation has a highly developed economy and world-leading tech industry, can it afford to wage this war? What's the price Israel must pay to defend itself? Well, to talk about all of this and more, I am joined today by Professor Esteban Klor, Senior Researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, and Rosita Herzog, Professor of Economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Esteban, thank you for being with us on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I want us to begin by, before we talk about exactly how this war has clearly impacted the economy, let's take us back more than 13 months ago, where the economy was at before the war started on October 7th, 2023, because many people might remember the economy had a negative outlook at that point due to all of the judicial reform protests we saw in the streets. So even before this war started, what was the Israeli economy looking like?
Well, I prefer to go back to 2022, and 2022 was a good year for the economy. We had a budget surplus, and the debt to GDP ratio was around 60%, and that's how we started 2023. And as you mentioned before, it was a tumultuous year and with a negative outlook, but with a low debt to GDP ratio, which allow us now, during the war, to borrow towards the future. So we're basically borrowing now using government deficits to finance the war, thanks to the fact that in 2022, we lower the debt to GDP ratio to 60%. As you mentioned, 2023 was a difficult year. Financial markets were there was a lot of uncertainty, also in terms of the exchange rate and in terms of the stock market in Israel and the high-tech sector, and that's how we reached October 6, October 7 with the beginning of the war.
So it wasn't necessarily a negative time for the economy, but we can't say that it was necessarily a positive time either.
Correct. In terms of economic growth, the outlook was not good, but in terms of reserves of the central bank, and the amount of debt that the Israeli economy had, it was actually a good starting point.
Yeah, we're looking at, from the Bank of Israel, $200 billion in foreign currency reserves. Unemployment was at a pretty low point, 3.5% unemployment during that time. And inflation, roughly around the same amount, I guess we could say, 3.8% inflation during that time.
Which wasn't an outlier compared to other countries in the world. So there was a period with high inflation worldwide, so we weren't different than the other countries were comparing us to. So it was okay in terms of inflation. If we can jump to nowadays, so now we do have higher inflation than most of Western countries, and that's a serious problem.
So what is inflation looking like now, 13 months later, now that Israel has been fighting a war for more than 400 days?
Well, if we go back, one of the main impacts of the war, we tend to think about Israel as an island in terms of the economy, because most of our products are imported through the sea. And that was affected greatly by the war because of the attacks from Yemen and also the embargo from Turkey and other countries that are using similar tactics. So the cost of living in Israel is increasing rapidly, and we can see that in the inflation rate. In addition to that, there were close to 120,000 Palestinians from the West Bank that were working in Israel, mostly in the agricultural sector and in the construction sector, that are not allowed to come into Israel anymore since October 7th, 2023. And therefore, that also is impacting the cost of those two sectors that are critical for the Israeli economy.
I think this is such an interesting point that many don't realize when it comes to the repercussions of this war, and it's taking away those work permits for these Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza that were coming in and really building many of the different projects here in Israel. And so without that, what type of an impact losing that workforce, not only the Palestinian labor workforce, but also foreign workers as well?
Correct. So as I mentioned before, the immediate impact in terms of the agricultural sector is an increase in the cost of living, the price of vegetables and fruits. And in terms of the construction sector, so we see a delay in terms of infrastructure projects, also public projects, construction of roads and constructions of buildings and apartments, and the price of the apartments, it's going up significantly as a consequence of that, of a shortage of people. Foresee that there's going to be a shortage in the supply of apartments in the near future, in 2, 3, 4 years.
Well, so we're already feeling those repercussions right now. And this also isn't the only section of the labor market that has been impacted. We saw roughly 300,000 reservists get called up to action and fight in the war. So them also leaving these other sections of Israeli workplace and labor market. What type of an impact has the whole reservist community had?
Correct. So we saw that particularly at the beginning of the war, the first 3 up to 6 months of the war, we had like close to 10% of the labor force that was enlisted in the army, and that hurt the productivity of the Israeli economy at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. We're recovering from that now very slowly as less and less people enlist as reservists in the army.
But there still are many that are still fighting in this war. It might not still be the same amount that we saw last November 2023, but still November 2024, we're still seeing a section of the workforce, not only from the reservists, but from the Palestinian labor market and from the foreign workers. And this all still has a continuing effect for the past 13 months.
Yes, and we see that in terms of GDP growth. We have negative GDP growth per capita also in 2023. We will have negative GDP growth per capita in 2024. And the outlook for 2025 is not that great either. And so we are in a recession.
We are in a recession.
Yes.
And how do you initially declare something like that for a country as a whole?
Well, so we follow quarters, correct? So we had right now the last quarter of 2023 and the first 3 quarters of 2024 officially with negative GDP per capita growth. We're waiting for the numbers of the last quarter of 2024. I'm willing to bet that it's also going to be negative. And in terms of 2025, it depends in terms of whether the war is going to end, in which front it's going to end, and if it doesn't end, what's the intensity of the fighting and the number of soldiers that are being enlisted to fight that particular front. That's going to have a direct impact on the economy as well.
And as you mentioned, we likely will see a hit to the last quarter of this year, as this is the quarter that we've also seen an increase in fighting on the northern front, Israel ramping up its operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so even for the past 9 to 10 months, we saw a real focus on the fighting in Gaza. But in the past 2 to 3 months, this final quarter of the year, it's not only the increase of fighting against Hezbollah, but against Iran itself. What type of a cost does this expansion of the war have on the economy?
Well, there is a direct cost in terms of the ammunition that you're using and the soldiers that are directly involved in the fighting. And there is a long-term cost in terms of increasing the uncertainty of the country as a whole, in terms of like the willingness to make business in international investors to come and invest in Israel and to start new companies and new ventures. And we're going to see that affecting us for the next few years. In addition to that, the cost of the war, as I mentioned before, we're paying that using increasing government debt, and the interest rates on that debt are going up, which actually also make us think that the forecast for the Israeli economy in the next 3, 4, 5 years is not going to be great. And something that we will have to talk soon probably is that we more than double defense spending at the expense of other spending, or at the expense of investments in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in the population, and the repercussions of that are also going to be visible for at least 3 to 5 years.
And I want us to get to the budget, the proposed budget that the state has passed in just a moment. But you're talking about this foreign investment with all of the lack of certainty, the uncertainty when it comes to this prolonged war. And so is there anything that Israel can do to incentivize foreign investors to come and spend their money and boost the Israeli economy?
Well, to have a serious and reliable economic policy, I would start with that, to have clear numbers in terms of what's the expenditure in what is the budget deficit is going to be, and also investment in human capital and in infrastructure, connectivity of the periphery to the center, etc. I wouldn't give direct benefits to foreign investors, but I would provide a very energetic economic environment, and the Israeli human capital that was able to attract them in the past. And I hope that if we go back to that, that may also be pulling foreign investors in the future, pulling foreign investors into Israel in the future.
If you make it an exciting atmosphere to spend in, then other people want to join in, but that doesn't seem to be what we're seeing right now when we look at Israeli consumer spending within Israel. It's declined 27% over the past year. We're also talking about, you mentioned exports, imports. Imports have declined by 42%, exports by 18%. That was in the final quarter of 2023. So is this another trend that we'll likely see continued?
Well, in terms of imports, I'm not sure whether that's because we are consuming less or because foreign countries are less willing to trade with us. Also, imports are more expensive in terms of like the shipping costs because of what happens in Yemen.
In the Red Sea, when the Yemens attack, it disrupts everything, the economy all over the world.
And the Turkish embargo, correct. So I don't want to put too much emphasis into that. And we will see what happens with foreign trade. It's not clear yet. And in the midst of the war, it's difficult to figure it out. Hopefully, by the end of the war, we will see whether we're moving to a new equilibrium or we will go back to where we were in 2022 or at the beginning of 2023.
So let's talk about that then, because this proposed budget for the 2025 fiscal year, it should hopefully help set up Israel not only to defend itself, but also to prolonged economic success, or at least not economic deficit. And so can you break down kind of the highlights of what we should expect by this new Israeli government state budget?
Well, the main goal, I guess, of the budget was to calm foreign investors, that Israel will enact a responsible economic policy with a low government deficit. And we had huge deficits in 2023, and also the deficit in 2024 is actually higher than the one that was approved in the budget for 2024. At the beginning of the budget, they were talking about a 5% deficit. Then they approved a budget with stipulated for a 6.6% deficit, and we're right now over 7% deficit. So an important thing is just to set a goal and to stick to it and try to fulfill that. The finance minister talked about, or goal was to set a deficit of 4% of GDP. Right now, the government just approved a week ago a budget with a deficit of 4.3 of GDP, like they crossed that line, and now they have to bring that to the parliament. I expect that the actual deficit will be over 5%. So if the first goal was to calm foreign investors and to say that we are not going to overspend like we did in 2024 or the last quarter of 2023, I think we failed that goal because I'm expecting the budget to come out of the parliament with a deficit of 5%, and there is also a defense committee right now that is going to make suggestions to the defense budget, and probably they're going to ask to increase defense spending. So the current budget with a deficit of 4.3, we already know that this defense commission that is going to send recommendations in a month is going to ask for increasing the defense spending, and so that's going to affect the deficit. That was the first problem. The second problem is that the government budget is not changing the economic priorities and adapting them to the current environment where we have a war in so many different fronts. So it was expected that the government will take responsibility and do some cuts of some of the government spending in terms of like the number of ministries that we have, in terms of the coalitional money that the government is distributing, and they didn't do that. And it's not a lot of money. I'm going to have to admit, it's not that cutting a ministry or cutting some of the political spending will make a huge difference, but it's just showing that you understand their situation and that you're also willing to cut things that hurt you in some way.
And that's the controversy right now. There's in this proposed budget, it's approximately 4.1 billion shekels that's designated just for coalition funds. And so many of the critics, they're arguing that the government is using this for political needs rather than those of the Israeli public and defense needs.
Correct. And again, 4.1 billion shekels is not a lot of money in terms of the overall budget, but it's just showing that you are taking responsibility of the situation, and you're not only asking from the working population to sacrifice, but you're willing to to make sacrifices yourself. And so the government is missing that. And the third point, which I just mentioned, it is like all of the burden of this new budget is falling on working families, and middle class and working families are the ones that are going to suffer the most from this trying to keep the budget deficit at a reasonable level. So we increase taxes on working families, we increase income taxes, basically by the certain aspects of the income tax were actually increasing the income payments that people will have to make. We're increasing the Social Security taxes on individuals. So working families are going to suffer the most.
They're the ones who are taking the brunt of this.
Correct. And instead of using this opportunity to include other sectors of the country into the working force and trying to promote different changes into the way we are paying for this war, the government is doing a lot of the same. So it's basically asking from working families to serve in the army, to increase taxes and to somehow manage, whereas other sectors of the population that don't serve in the army and don't participate actively in the labor force are receiving certain sectorial budgets and are not actually suffering from paying the
It was
war.
expected that during a war, taxes will likely increase. So does this come as a surprise to anyone that these taxes, and oftentimes taxes often go to the working class, that they could be taking the brunt of that? Is that surprising in any way?
No, it's in a certain way, it's good that taxes are increasing to diminish as much as possible the deficit. But on the other side, you can also say, well, we should cut certain benefits and allowances to non-working parts of the population, and the government is not doing that significantly. So in a way, taxes are increasing, the brunt is falling on working families, and other sectors are enjoying allowances and benefits that the government is not cutting enough to incentivize them to join the labor force.
So when you look at this proposed budget then, Esteban, what would be your recommendations and the INSS's recommendations to the government when it comes to different policy recommendations going forward in making this a fiscally responsible budget, all in times of war?
So I guess some of the recommendations are clear from what I just said. Cut some of the political spending, just lead by example. That would be my first thing. The second thing would be we have to increase taxes. We have to increase income taxes, VAT, Social Security, but do it in a way that you are also cutting some benefits that are incentivizing people to stay away from the labor force. So try to incentivize different sectors of the population, especially the Arab sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector, to join the labor force and be part of this national effort. And the third recommendation would be to be careful about increases in defense spending. So it's very easy during a war to increase defense spending. Defense spending at the beginning, in 2023, before the war started, was about 4% of GDP. It was 65 billion shekels. And the budgeted spending for 2025 is already close to 120 billion shekels without including American aid. So American aid will bring us to 140 billion shekels. And this is before we receive the recommendations of the Nagel Commission that will probably add 20 to 30 billion shekels to the defense spending. That's a huge burden, and it's not clear that the economy will be able to sustain that burden for a long time. It is clear that we need to increase defense spending, but we have to be careful and we have to be smart in the way we do that, okay? So after the war of 1973, defense spending skyrocketed to close to 30% of GDP, and as a consequence of that, we had what we call the lost decade, where we had 10, in reality 12 years of terrible economic performance in the country, and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability and high inflation, hyperinflation in the early 1980s, and the inflation rate in 1985, the beginning of 1985, was close to 450%. So we need to try to avoid at all costs to do that again.
I think that really boils down the main topic of this podcast today, and it's how much Israel should be focusing on the economy versus defense spending, and especially in a time of war. How much should they prioritize thinking about the economy when they're making these strategic military decisions?
Well, I'm not going to say that you need to prioritize the economy, but you shouldn't neglect it either. Okay, you should keep an eye on the economy. You should think about the day after the war, because if we don't have a strong economy, it's going to be difficult to sustain this effort for a number of years. So we need to understand that this war may end, but the new reality we live in with Iran is still going to be there, and we still will need to increase defense spending. By how much and how we do it and where we do it, those are critical questions. And I hope that doubling defense spending is not the new normal, because I doubt that the economy will be able to sustain that for a long time.
It's not a sustainable approach, it seems. Esteban, as we're wrapping up here, we've been going pretty in-depth into these main topics. I want to ask you a quick rapid-fire round, some quick questions, and just tell me the first thought that really comes to your mind when I ask you this.
Sure.
The first one being, can the Israeli economy bounce back right now?
Not to where we were in 2022, but we can improve slowly. We will not go back to 2022 because defense spending is not going to go back to 2022.
So how long will it take Israel to reach these pre-war economy levels?
Well, that depends on government policy and on having a serious plan and a serious fiscal policy and a responsible policy, and trying to change priorities as well, including new sectors into the economy, investing in human capital, investing in infrastructure, investing in the periphery and connecting the periphery to the central part of the country. So it depends on the government.
Well, you kind of tie in my next question there. Is the Israeli government setting its priorities correctly?
Not right now, not based on the budget that they approved a week ago. And I guess eventually they will have to realize that we cannot go back to 2020, to October 6th, like we say here, in terms of fiscal spending. We need a new mindset, and we have to basically focus all of our civilian spending into policies that support economic growth. So whatever you're doing, that sometimes if you have extra money, you can support populations at the expense of productivity and economic growth. This is not the time to do that.
And so when it comes down to it, who hurts the most from this costly price of war?
So I'm going to say that we're all hurting, correct? But I really, really feel sorry for the Miluim soldier, the reservist soldier that also has to suffer fighting in the war, leaving probably his family behind for long periods of time, and the family has to make do with the cost of living skyrocketing, maybe losing some jobs, and so I would say the middle class, the young middle class families, who's one of the members of the family is actively fighting in the war.
And it seems like, as you mentioned, they might be feeling it the most, but everyone in Israel is certainly feeling this, and we'll have to see what happens with the upcoming budget and if the government prioritizes exactly what's happening in the economy right now. For now, Professor Esteban Klor, thank you for giving us your insight into this complex topic often. We appreciate having you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
To all of our listeners listening at home, that's all we have for you on this week's edition of the National Security Podcast here on I-24 News. I'm Nicole Zedeck, and thanks for listening.